The garden was still dark when she arrived, her heart shattered like the stone tomb she sought. She came expecting death, carrying spices for a corpse. She found instead an empty grave and a voice that spoke her name. Subscribe if you love Jesus. There are moments in history when everything changes, when the course of human destiny pivots on a single encounter, a single word spoken in the half-light of dawn. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the greatest of these moments, the hinge upon which all eternity swings. And yet, when we look closely at the gospel accounts, we discover something both tender and astounding. The first person to see the risen Lord, the first witness to the most important event in human history, was not Peter, not John, not any of the 12 apostles. It was a woman named Mary from the town of Magdalene, a woman whose past was shadowed by darkness, whose present was consumed by grief, and whose future would be forever marked by an encounter in a garden at sunrise. To understand the magnitude of this choice, God's choice to reveal His risen Son first to Mary Magdalene, we must first understand who Mary was, what she had been delivered from, and what her presence at the tomb tells us about the upside-down kingdom of God. The Gospels tell us that Mary Magdalene was a woman from whom Jesus had cast out 7 demons. This brief notation, mentioned in Luke chapter 8 and Mark chapter 16, opens a window into a life that had been consumed by torment. In the ancient world, demon possession was understood as a profound spiritual affliction, not merely mental illness, though the symptoms could overlap, but a genuine oppression by malevolent spiritual forces. The number 7 in Hebrew thought often symbolized completeness or fullness. 7 demons would indicate not just possession, but total possession, a life utterly overwhelmed by darkness. We do not know the specific nature of Mary's torment. The scriptures do not indulge our curiosity about the details of her suffering. But we can imagine what it might have meant: years of isolation, perhaps violent episodes, certainly social ostracism, the kind of profound alienation that comes when your own mind and body feel like enemy territory. In a culture where women already held a precarious social position, to be afflicted by demons would have placed Mary at the absolute margins of society. She would have been feared, avoided, considered unclean, perhaps even dangerous. Her family may have kept her locked away, as was sometimes the custom with those deemed mad or possessed. Her community would have whispered about her, crossed the street to avoid her, attributed her condition to sin or divine judgment. The weight of that existence is almost impossible to fathom. To live day after day without control of your own faculties, without peace in your own skin, without hope of relief or redemption, this was Mary's reality. The demons that tormented her were not metaphorical. They were real, malicious, intent on destruction, and they had full access to her life. Whatever Mary had been before the possession, whatever dreams she had harbored, whatever personality had been hers, whatever future she had imagined, all of it was buried beneath the chaos of spiritual oppression. And then Jesus came. We do not have the account of Mary's deliverance recorded in full narrative form, but we know it happened. At some point in the dusty villages of Galilee, this woman who had been captive to hell itself encountered the Son of God, and in His presence, the demons fled. 7 times Jesus commanded darkness to depart, and 7 times it obeyed. Imagine the moment when clarity returned, when, after months or years of torment, Mary's mind became her own again. When the voices stopped, when the chaos subsided, when she could think her own thoughts, speak her own words, make her own choices. Imagine the first breath of freedom after suffocation, the first moment of silence after cacophony, the first glimpse of your own face in water and recognizing yourself again. And imagine looking up from that deliverance and seeing the face of the one who had spoken your freedom. Jesus did not turn away in disgust. He did not maintain a safe distance. He did not treat her deliverance as merely a demonstration of His power. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a victim of darkness, but as a daughter of Abraham, a soul worth redeeming, a life worth restoring. In His eyes, she found not pity, but recognition, not condescension, but dignity, not dismissal, but invitation. From that moment, Mary Magdalene became one of Jesus' most devoted followers. Luke tells us in chapter 8 that she was among a group of women who traveled with Jesus and the 12 disciples, supporting them out of their own means. This detail is remarkable on multiple levels. First, it tells us that Mary had resources. She was not destitute. The tradition that she was a prostitute has no biblical foundation whatsoever. More likely, she was a woman of some means from the prosperous fishing town of Magdalene on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Her ability to financially support Jesus' ministry indicates that she had property or wealth of her own, which was unusual but not impossible for women of that era, particularly widows or women who had inherited family estates. Second, and more significantly, the fact that she traveled with Jesus and the disciples was virtually unheard of in first-century Jewish culture. Respectable rabbis did not allow women to follow them as disciples. Women were not counted in synagogue quorums. They were not taught the Torah in the same way men were. They were, with few exceptions, confined to domestic spheres, their religious lives mediated through fathers and husbands. The very idea of women traveling with an itinerant preacher, learning from him, being part of his inner circle, this was scandalous. It violated social convention. It challenged every norm about women's place and women's capacity. And yet, Jesus welcomed them. He taught them. He allowed them to sit at his feet and learn, as Martha's sister Mary did in Bethany, prompting Jesus to declare that she had chosen what is better when her sister complained that she should be helping with the meal preparations instead of listening to Jesus teach. This was revolutionary. Jesus was asserting that women had the same right to theological education, the same capacity for discipleship, the same calling to spiritual formation as men. In a world that largely treated women as property, as minors in perpetual need of male guardianship, Jesus treated them as fully human, fully capable, fully valued members of the kingdom of God. Mary Magdalene was part of this revolutionary community. She who had been possessed was now a disciple. She who had been ostracized was now part of the inner circle. She who had known only darkness now walked in the light of the world. Day after day, she listened to Jesus teach. She watched him heal the sick and raise the dead. She saw him challenge the religious authorities and welcome sinners and speak of a kingdom not of this world. She witnessed his compassion, his wisdom, his authority. And she loved him not with romantic love, as later legend would wrongly suggest, but with the total devotion of one who has been saved from destruction, the fierce loyalty of one who has been given back her life. We can trace Mary's journey through the Gospels in glimpses. She was there when Jesus taught the crowds on hillsides. She was there when he fed the 5,000. She was there in the towns and villages as he proclaimed the good news of the kingdom. She saw the opposition building, heard the threats from the religious leaders, sensed the danger closing in, and when Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem for that final Passover, knowing what awaited him there, Mary Magdalene followed. The Gospels tell us that Jesus predicted his death multiple times. He told the disciples plainly that he would be betrayed, handed over to the Gentiles, mocked, flogged, and killed, and that on the third day he would rise again. But the disciples could not grasp it. The concept of a suffering Messiah did not fit their expectations. They heard his words about death, but somehow filtered out or reinterpreted them. Peter even rebuked Jesus for speaking of his death, earning the sharp response, "Get behind me, Satan! You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Did Mary understand what was coming? Probably not fully, but she followed anyway. She accompanied Jesus and the others to Jerusalem for what would be his last Passover. She was there during that week of mounting tension, when the religious authorities' plots intensified and Judas made his devil's bargain. And when the moment of crisis came, when soldiers arrested Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and dragged him away for trial, Mary did not flee. This is one of the most striking elements of the Passion narratives, the contrast between the male disciples and the women who followed Jesus. When Jesus was arrested, the Gospels tell us that all the disciples deserted him and fled. Peter followed at a distance and then denied knowing Jesus 3 times. The others hid, paralyzed by fear and confusion. their dreams of a political Messiah crushed by the spectacle of their leader bound and beaten. But the women stayed. Through the nightmarish hours of Jesus' trial, the mockery, the false witnesses, the brutal treatment, and through the morning horror of his crucifixion, the women remained. Mary Magdalene was there. She watched as Jesus was paraded through the streets, carrying his cross. She followed to Golgotha, the place of execution, and John chapter 19 records that she stood near the cross itself, along with Jesus' mother Mary, Mary the wife of Clopas, and John the beloved disciple. Try to grasp what this meant for her. This was not an abstract theological event. This was personal. The man dying in agony before her eyes was the one who had saved her life. He had looked at her when no one else would. He had spoken freedom when everyone else had spoken condemnation. He had seen her humanity when others saw only demons. He had given her back her mind, her dignity, her hope, her very self. He had welcomed her as a disciple when the world said women were not worthy of such honor. He had treated her as fully human in a culture that often treated women as less than. And now he was being destroyed. Crucifixion was designed not just to kill, but to humiliate, to reduce a person to a writhing, gasping animal, stripped of all dignity and humanity. The Romans used it specifically for that purpose, to make a spectacle of their power and to terrorize subject populations into submission. Victims often hung for hours or even days, slowly suffocating, their bodies racked with pain, while crowds mocked and soldiers gambled for their clothes. Jesus endured all of this, and Mary Magdalene watched. She heard the crowd's taunts. She heard the religious leaders mock him, saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself." She heard the criminals crucified beside him, one hurling insults, the other pleading for mercy. She heard Jesus speak from the cross, words of forgiveness for his executioners, words of promise to the repentant thief, words of concern for his mother, words of anguish in the darkness. She watched as the sky went dark at midday, as if creation itself could not bear to witness what was happening. She heard him cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And she heard his final words, "It is finished." And then he was gone. The man who had healed the sick and raised the dead, who had calmed storms and cast out demons, who had spoken with an authority that made even his enemies marvel, he was dead. His head slumped forward, his chest stopped heaving, the life drained out of him, and Mary stood there, unable to stop it, unable to change it, unable to do anything but witness and weep. The Gospels do not record Mary's words at the cross, only her presence. But her presence speaks volumes. It says, "I will not abandon you." It says, "You did not leave me in my darkness, so I will not leave you in yours." It says, "Even if this is the end, even if everything we hoped for dies with you on this tree, I will be here." There is a kind of love that does not calculate costs or measure outcomes. It simply remains. Mary Magdalene embodied that love. When Jesus finally died, around 3 in the afternoon on that Friday we now call Good, the narrative urgency increased. The Sabbath was coming at sunset, and Jewish law forbade work on the Sabbath, including burial preparations. Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin who had not consented to Jesus' condemnation, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate, surprised that Jesus had died so quickly, granted the request. Joseph, along with Nicodemus, who had first come to Jesus by night and now came to honor him in death, took Jesus' body down from the cross. Mary Magdalene and the other women followed. They watched as Joseph and Nicodemus wrapped Jesus' body in linen cloths with myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds of spices, according to Jewish burial customs. They observed as the men carried the body to a new tomb carved out of rock in a garden near the place of crucifixion. They saw them roll a large stone across the entrance. Mark chapter 15 verse 47 specifically states that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where Jesus was laid. They made note of the location. They were planning ahead. Because the burial had been hasty, incomplete, there had not been time to properly anoint the body with all the customary spices and perfumes. The women wanted to return and complete the burial rites as soon as the Sabbath was over. So they went home and prepared additional spices and perfumes, even as the sun was setting and the Sabbath was beginning. Can you imagine that Sabbath for Mary? 24 hours of forced inactivity while the one she loved lay cold in a tomb. The law said rest, but how could she rest? The law said do no work, but her heart was working overtime, replaying every moment, every word, every teaching, trying to make sense of senseless violence. She had seen Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead. She had seen him heal the blind and the lame. She had watched him cast out demons. She herself was proof of his power over darkness. She had heard him teach about the kingdom of God with an authority that made the religious experts look like children playing at wisdom. And yet, he had not saved himself. He had not called down angels. He had not demonstrated his power when it mattered most. He had not stepped down from the cross in triumph. He had simply died, like any other man, like any other victim of Rome's brutal machinery of execution. What did this mean? Had they all been wrong about him? Had their hopes been nothing but delusion? Was the kingdom he preached merely a beautiful dream that died with him on Golgotha? These questions must have tormented Mary through those long Sabbath hours. Everything she had built her new life upon seemed to have collapsed. The one who had given her freedom was himself bound by death. The one who had cast out her demons was himself defeated by evil. The light of the world had been extinguished. The Sabbath must have felt like drowning in darkness. As soon as the Sabbath ended at sunset on Saturday, Mary and the other women could legally resume their preparations. They gathered their spices and perfumes. They planned to go to the tomb at first light as early as possible while still being able to see what they were doing. Luke chapter 24 tells us that the women were Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and others with them. They were going together, supporting one another in their grief, determined to offer this final act of love. So Mary Magdalene rose in the darkness of Sunday morning while the city still slept. John chapter 20 tells us that she came to the tomb while it was still dark, not at dawn, before dawn. She could not wait for full daylight. Grief does not keep normal hours. Love does not calculate convenience. As soon as there was enough light to navigate the streets, Mary was on her way, carrying her spices, expecting nothing but a corpse, planning only to honor a dead teacher one last time. She made her way through Jerusalem's quiet streets, past the houses where people still slept, past the temple compound where the religious authorities who had condemned Jesus were resting in their righteousness, out through one of the city gates, toward the garden where Joseph's tomb stood. Perhaps she walked alone, ahead of the others. Perhaps she was so consumed by her need to reach Jesus that she could not match her pace to anyone else's. And when she arrived at the tomb, while the sky was still more black than blue, while stars still hung above the garden, she found the impossible. The stone was rolled away. The massive stone, the kind that would have required several men to move, was simply gone from the entrance. Not cracked, not chipped away, not broken. Just rolled aside as if it weighed nothing, as if it were a pebble instead of a boulder. The tomb stood open like a mouth gaping in shock, like a cave exhaling, like a prison with its doors blown off. Mary's first thought was not resurrection. Why would it be? Despite Jesus' repeated predictions that he would rise on the third day, despite his assurances that death would not hold him, despite everything he had said and taught, the idea that someone could die and come back to life was simply not part of her mental framework in that moment. We always hear what we are able to hear, and in her grief, Mary had heard only death. Resurrection was a doctrine for the last day, not for a Sunday morning in a Jerusalem garden. So she assumed the worst: grave robbery. In the ancient world, tombs were sometimes plundered for their contents or desecrated by enemies. Perhaps the religious authorities had stolen the body to prevent the tomb from becoming a shrine. Perhaps grave robbers had taken it thinking they would find valuable burial goods. Perhaps Roman soldiers had removed it for reasons of their own. Whatever the explanation, the body was gone. And for Mary, this was a fresh horror piled on top of unbearable grief. They had killed him. They had mocked him. They had crucified him publicly, shamefully, brutally, and now they had not even left her the dignity of caring for his body. They had taken her Lord. That phrase echoes through John's account. They have taken my Lord, and she did not know where they had laid him. She turned and ran. John tells us she ran to find Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, traditionally identified as John himself. She came breathless to where they were staying and gasped out the terrible news. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. Notice that she said, "We don't know." Perhaps the other women had arrived by then and seen the open tomb as well. Or perhaps Mary used the plural because she was speaking for all the grieving disciples. But the urgent message was clear. Jesus' body was missing. The tomb was empty. Something had happened, and it was not good. Peter and John immediately ran to the tomb. John, being younger, outran Peter and arrived first. He bent down and looked into the tomb. He could see the linen burial cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Perhaps he was afraid. Perhaps he was hesitant to enter a tomb and risk ritual defilement. Peter, characteristically impulsive, had no such hesitation. He arrived moments later and went straight inside. What they saw was strange. The burial cloths were there, the strips of linen that had wrapped Jesus' body. But the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up separately, lying apart from the other cloths. This detail is significant. If grave robbers had stolen the body, they would not have carefully unwrapped it and folded the headcloth. They would have taken the body as it was or dumped the cloths in a heap. The scene suggested something else entirely, something orderly, something deliberate, something that defied normal explanation. John tells us that he then went in as well, and he saw and believed. But the very next verse says, they still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. So what did John believe in that moment? Perhaps he believed Mary's report that something extraordinary had happened. Perhaps he believed that this was not ordinary grave robbery, but he did not yet grasp the full truth. The resurrection was so far outside their categories of thought that even seeing the empty tomb, even seeing the burial cloths arranged in a way that suggested Jesus had simply passed through them, they could not quite put the pieces together. So Peter and John went back to where the other disciples were staying, their minds reeling, trying to make sense of what they had seen. They would report to the others. They would discuss and debate. They would wonder and worry. But Mary stayed. This is crucial. Everyone else left, but Mary stayed at the tomb. She had followed Peter and John back to the garden, and now, as they departed, she remained. She stood outside the tomb weeping. The Greek word used here suggests loud lamentation, not quiet tears. She was sobbing, overcome with grief that had now been compounded by the violation of Jesus' tomb. John chapter 20 verse 11 says, she bent over to look into the tomb, and what she saw was impossible. Two angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and one at the foot. These were not ordinary men. The description, clothed in white, positioned at either end of where a body had lain, marks them as heavenly beings, messengers of God. In other gospel accounts, the angel's appearance causes fear and amazement. Matthew says one angel's appearance was like lightning, and his clothes white as snow, and the guards shook with fear and became like dead men. But Mary, in her all-consuming grief, barely reacted to their presence. Her sorrow was so deep that even angels could not distract her from it. The angels asked her a simple question, "Woman, why are you crying?" It was a pastoral question, an invitation to express her pain, and Mary's answer reveals everything about where her heart was. They have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have put him. My Lord. Not the teacher, not Jesus, not even the Messiah. My Lord. Personal, possessive, intimate. He belonged to her, not in any proprietary sense, but in the sense that her whole life had become bound up with his. He was hers in the way that freedom is yours when you've been released from chains, and the way that sight is yours when you've been blind and now can see. They had taken her, Lord, and she was undone. Even angels could not console her. Even the supernatural could not penetrate her sorrow. She wanted Jesus, not explanations. She wanted the one she loved, not theological answers. Nothing else would do. And then, in one of the most beautiful moments in all of Scripture, in one of the most tender scenes in all of human history, everything changed. Mary turned around. Perhaps she heard a sound behind her. Perhaps she sensed a presence. Perhaps the angel's gaze shifted to look at someone standing there. For whatever reason, she turned and she saw a man standing in the garden. She did not recognize him. John explicitly tells us this. She did not realize it was Jesus. Perhaps her eyes were blurred with tears. Perhaps in her grief, she was not looking carefully at faces, but just wanted to be left alone with her sorrow. Perhaps there was a divine veiling of recognition, as happened with the disciples on the road to Emmaus later that same day, when Jesus walked with them for hours and they did not know him until he broke bread. The text does not explain why Mary did not recognize him. It simply states the fact she saw him but did not know him. The man asked her 2 questions. "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" They were gentle questions, kind questions, but they assumed she had lost something or someone that could be found. Mary, thinking he was the gardener, which makes perfect sense since they were in a garden and it was early morning, and a gardener might reasonably be working there at that hour, made her desperate plea. "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Notice what she did not say. She did not say Jesus. She did not say the body. She just said him, assuming the gardener would know whom she meant, assuming her grief was so obvious that no explanation was needed. There is something almost childlike in her words, a simplicity born of overwhelming sorrow. She was not trying to be clear or articulate. She was just begging for help. And notice her offer. "I will get him." A single woman offering to carry a dead body herself if necessary. Never mind that a corpse would be heavy, unwieldy, impossible for one person to move. Never mind that she had no place to take it, no tomb of her own, no plan beyond the simple need to have his body back. Love is not always rational. Love will promise impossible things. Mary would have carried him if she could. She would have done anything, borne any burden, paid any price, if only she could tend to him one more time. And then Jesus spoke one word, Mary, just her name in his voice. The particular inflection, the specific tone, the tenderness that she recognized instantly because she had heard it 100 times before. The way he said her name when he taught her. The way he said her name when he welcomed her as a disciple. The way he said her name that made her know she was seen, valued, loved. Mary. And immediately, in the space of a heartbeat, everything shifted. The veil lifted. Recognition flooded in. Grief transformed into astonishment. Despair gave way to wonder. Death exploded into life. She turned toward him. John says she turned toward him, suggesting she had perhaps turned partially away. Thinking the gardener conversation was over, and she cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, Rabboni. Not rabbi, which was the common term for teacher. Rabboni, my great teacher, my master, a term of deep affection and personal devotion. It was an intimate form of address, expressing not just respect but love, not just recognition but relationship. Mary was not just identifying who he was, she was expressing who he was to her. We can only imagine the emotion in that moment, the shock that must have shaken her to her core, the joy that must have erupted like a fountain, the confusion that would come later but in that instant was drowned out by sheer, overwhelming gladness. The man she had watched die, the man she had come to anoint as a corpse, the man whose absence had shattered her world, he was standing before her, alive, whole, real. He was speaking her name. He was looking at her with those eyes that had always seen her, truly seen her. From the very first day, he cast out her demons. He was smiling at her, perhaps, or at least meeting her gaze with a warmth that told her this was no ghost, no vision, no grief-induced hallucination. This was Jesus, her Lord, her teacher, her deliverer, her friend. Risen, she must have reached for him, must have moved to embrace him, to touch him, to verify that he was truly there, truly real, truly flesh and blood, and not some phantom. Her hands must have stretched out toward him, in a gesture as old as human love, the need to touch what we thought we had lost, to hold what we feared was gone forever. Because Jesus' next words were, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father." These words have puzzled interpreters for centuries. Why could she not touch him? Why could she not embrace him? Later that same day, Jesus would invite Thomas to touch his wounds. He would appear to the disciples and eat fish with them. He clearly had a physical, touchable body, so why tell Mary not to hold on to him? Some scholars suggest that Jesus was indicating a new phase of relationship, that the old way of knowing him physically was passing, and soon he would ascend to the Father and send the Holy Spirit, establishing a new, spiritual presence with his followers that would not depend on physical proximity. The time for clinging to his physical presence was ending. A new mode of relationship was beginning. Others suggest he was simply saying, "Do not cling to me now. We do not have time for that. I have work for you to do. There's no need to hold on to me because I am not leaving immediately. You will see me again, but right now, you must go." The Greek word translated hold on or cling carries a sense of grasping, clutching, refusing to let go. Perhaps Jesus was gently correcting a desire in Mary to keep him there, to prevent any possibility of losing him again. She had lost him once, horribly, traumatically. Now that she had found him again, alive, the temptation to hold on and never let go must have been overwhelming. But Jesus was teaching her, teaching all of us, that resurrection life is not about clinging to past forms of relationship, but about embracing the new thing God is doing. Because immediately Jesus gave Mary Magdalene a commission. "Go to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." This is staggering on multiple levels. First, Jesus called the disciples my brothers. These were the men who had fled when he was arrested, who had denied and doubted him, who had hidden behind locked doors while he suffered and died. And he called them brothers, not servants, not followers, brothers. He was declaring that through his death and resurrection, a new relationship had been forged. His Father was now their Father. His God was now their God. The separation between divine and human, between holy God and sinful humanity, had been bridged by his sacrifice. They were family now. They were kin. Second, Jesus was sending Mary as a messenger, as an apostle, as the first preacher of the resurrection. The word apostle means sent one, and Jesus was sending Mary with the most important message in history. He is risen. Death is defeated. The new creation has begun. Go tell my brothers that I am ascending to the Father, and that relationship I have with him is now theirs as well. In doing this, Jesus was overturning centuries of cultural assumption about women's roles and women's testimony. In first century Jewish and Roman law, women were not considered reliable witnesses. Their testimony did not carry weight in court. If a legal case depended on witness testimony, women's voices did not count. They could not testify in most circumstances. Their word was not trusted. And yet Jesus chose a woman, not just any woman, but a woman who had been demon-possessed, who was thus doubly marginalized to be the first witness to the resurrection, the first preacher of the gospel, the first to proclaim the good news that changed everything. He made her the apostle to the apostles, the one who would bring the message to Peter and John and the rest. This was revolutionary. This was a direct challenge to the social order. This was Jesus, even in his resurrection, continuing to do what he had done throughout his ministry, elevating the lowly, honoring the marginalized, entrusting the most important tasks to those whom the world discounted. Mary obeyed. She went to the disciples with the news. John chapter 20 verse 18 says, Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. I have seen the Lord. 5 words that changed the world. 5 words that became the foundation of Christian faith. 5 words that Mary Magdalene was the first human being to speak. Not, "I heard that he is risen." Not, "I believe he might be alive." But, "I have seen the Lord." Direct testimony, eyewitness account, personal encounter. Mary was not speculating or hoping or inferring. She had seen him. She had heard him speak her name. She had received his commission. And now she was fulfilling that commission by telling the others. The other gospel accounts confirmed that she and the other women who had come to the tomb were the first to proclaim the resurrection. Matthew chapter 28 describes how Mary Magdalene and the other Mary met Jesus on their way to tell the disciples, and he greeted them, and they clasped his feet and worshiped him. Mark chapter 16. In the longer ending, though its authenticity is debated, says that Jesus appeared first to Mary Magdalene, and she went and told those who had been with him. Luke chapter 24 mentions that the women told the apostles about the empty tomb and the angel's message, though it does not specifically mention Mary's encounter with Jesus. But here is the tragic and revealing detail. Mark chapter 16 tells us that when Mary and the other women reported the resurrection to the disciples, they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Luke chapter 24 uses similar language. The apostles did not believe the women's report. It seemed like idle talk, like hysteria, like the kind of foolish chatter one would expect from grief-stricken women. Let that sink in. The most important news in human history was delivered by women, and the male disciples' first response was to dismiss it as nonsense. They did not believe Mary Magdalene. They did not believe what she had seen and heard. Even though she had been a faithful disciple for years, even though she had stood at the cross when they had fled, even though she had been the first to the tomb and had encountered the risen Lord himself, they did not take her testimony seriously. This detail is important for several reasons. Historically, it is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the authenticity of the resurrection accounts. If the gospel writers were making up a story and wanted it to be believed in their cultural context, they would never have made women the primary witnesses. They would have had Jesus appear first to Peter, or to all the apostles together, or to the Sanhedrin, or to Pilate. They would have structured the narrative so that credible witnesses, according to the standards of their day, meaning men, preferably multiple men of good reputation, were the first to see and report. The fact that all four Gospels insist that women, led by Mary Magdalene, were the first witnesses to the resurrection is powerful evidence that this is what actually happened. No one making up a story would have written it this way. The gospel writers included this detail despite the fact that it made their testimony less credible to their contemporaries, because they were committed to telling what had actually occurred, regardless of how it looked. But more than that, the disciples' disbelief of the women reveals something about human nature and about God's kingdom. The disciples had been taught by Jesus for 3 years. They had heard him predict his resurrection. They had seen him perform miracles that demonstrated his power over death. He had raised Lazarus, after all, and the widow's son at Nain, and Jairus' daughter. And yet, when the moment came, when the resurrection actually happened, they could not accept the testimony of women who had seen it. Why? Because cultural prejudice ran deeper than theological teaching. Because social conditioning was stronger than the evidence before them. Because the assumptions they had absorbed about women's unreliability as witnesses overrode what they knew about Mary Magdalene's character and devotion. And this is precisely why Jesus chose Mary Magdalene to be the first witness. He was making a point. He was, once again, turning the world's hierarchies up.